This podcast is brought to you by Sydney Health Partners, Maridulu, Budyari, Gumal, the Sydney Partnership for Health Education, Research and Enterprise, and New South Wales Regional Health Partners. We support our partner organisations to deliver high-quality clinical trials for the benefit of patient health and ongoing medical research.
Hi, welcome to episode 2 of the podcast series Clinical Trials in Focus. Episode 1 discussed clinical trial auditing, noting that an audit is a snapshot in time of a trial undertaken by an independent evaluator. And this episode today is about clinical trial monitoring. Clinical trial monitoring is an ongoing quality assurance process to make sure the trial is running in accordance with the regulations and the trial protocol. I'm Sharon Lee, Clinical Research Manager for Western Sydney Local Health District, and I'll be hosting today's discussion on monitoring of investigator-initiated and collaborative group studies. And joining me today, I've got Katherine Bolton. Katherine's the Research Manager from the Central Coast Local Health District. We also have Sally Dean joining us from Newcastle Private Hospital, and Sally's the Research Governance Coordinator there. And Kat Hogan from GenesisCare is also joining us, who's the Clinical Development Manager at GenesisCare. So welcome everyone. Thanks for bringing your expertise today to this exciting subject. With the introduction of the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework this year, we're all starting to think about how we're going to monitor the conduct of research within our institutions and hospitals. And we're here today to discuss the approaches that all of us are implementing as appropriate models for clinical trial monitoring within our institutions. Whilst we understand there are resource implications for our already stretched clinical trial coordinators and research office staff, today we're going to discuss the benefits for all of us and for our organisations, both public and private, and how we go about establishing systems to monitor and have the appropriate oversight and maintain GCP for the studies that are underway within our institution. And it's great to know that each of you here today has been able to rise to these challenges and develop models for clinical research monitoring that meet the needs within your own institutions. And I'm excited to hear about how you've set these up and how they're working and how things are going. Before we get to discussing the different models, what do we think are the benefits of instituting a monitoring process in our institutions? Sally, did you have any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Sharon. From my experience, an effective monitoring program serves as a great quality assurance tool to ensure that trials being run in adherence to all the required ethical and regulatory standards, as well as in compliance with the currently approved protocol amendments and site SOPs or standard operating procedures. It also provides a way of reviewing patient safety to ensure the rights and the well-being of all participants are being adequately protected. And finally, for me, it provides confidence in the trial data that's being collected to ensure that it's being collected and it's accurate, it's complete and verifiable from source documents. This ultimately provides confidence in the trial data that it's robust and can support the research question.
Great. Kat, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. I think Sally made a really good point around being able to trust the data that's coming out of trials. And just to add to that, I think in the investigator-initiated space, trials may have a reputation that they aren't as rigorous, or they might be of a lesser quality than their commercially run equivalents. And traditionally, there's been less scrutiny, and we've been subject to less scrutiny in this space. So I think with the implementation of the GCP inspection program and the trials governance framework, we're going to be increasingly held to account to be monitoring our investigator-initiated trials. And I think hopefully the benefit of that will be that that'll break down some of those perceptions and barriers.
Excellent. Katherine, did you have anything to add there?
So I'm from Central Coast Local Health District, so we're quite a small health district, but doing the clinical trials has allowed us to have oversight over the clinical trials and to identify any of the gaps or barriers. And then our research office is able to help those investigators to help fill any of those gaps and provide them support.
Okay. So it sounds like this is really a great opportunity for everyone to be involved, from researchers to research office. And, perhaps it's a positive thing. We can identify some educational opportunities for our research staff. Interestingly, that monitoring a research project could possibly, lead to some more educational opportunities and improved study outcomes, as Katherine said. So thanks for that. Sounds like we all agree that it's a good thing. Katherine, can you tell us about the system that you've established within Central Coast Local Health District? You said it's quite a small LHD.
Yes, it is. And I suppose a lot of our clinical trials were operating pretty much in silos with their own clinical trial units and coordinators and managers. So it's been an opportunity for us to reach out to them and form relationships with them. And our process for monitoring is a risk-based program. So for the investigator-initiated trials that don't have a commercial sponsor already doing monitoring. And after authorisation, we monitor them 1 year after authorisation, and then every 2 years following that until they're closed to recruitment. We can shorten that time frame if we think it's required based on observed risks or any concerns we might have. And one of our research governance officers schedules visits with the principal investigator to find a time that suits both. We send them an introductory letter explaining why we're going to be conducting the monitoring. We give them a checklist so that they can help prepare for the monitoring visit. And we also then audit our own files to see if there's anything outstanding, such as annual reports, which we can ask for via email before actually conducting the visit. And then when the research governance officer visits the clinical trial unit, they have a tool or a checklist, normally takes between 1.5 and 2 hours. So we don't delve deeply into the data. It's mainly about checking their documentation and filing processes. And then we communicate the findings via email for follow-up. And I suppose the most common findings are things like expired GCP, the Good Clinical Practice certificates, and we can provide them options for doing those to get up to date. Sometimes there might not be a delegation or a training log, and we can provide them a template for that. And occasionally maybe consent forms haven't been dated when signed, but that type of thing that we can make sure the investigators check on in future.
So it sounds like you've got a really good system going up there. Kat, can you tell us from a private research facility, what have you set up, and do you monitor all studies? Do you take a more risk-based approach? How do you tackle this?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. So we at GenesisCare employ a risk-based approach to our monitoring, and that's based on the NHMRC risk-based monitoring guidance that's available on their website. So generally, what that means is that for every study, we have a trial management committee that's responsible for overseeing a trial. And the trial management committee consists of the chief investigators as well as the key research management personnel who at the start of a study will conduct a risk assessment to determine what the monitoring requirements will be for that study and develop the monitoring plan. From there, they then draft up the monitoring plan, and we've got a series of templates for letters, monitoring reports and that sort of thing that the staff use and adapt for that particular study based on the monitoring plan that's been drafted up by the TMC.
Great. So do you have a template for the monitoring plan for the researchers?
Yeah, we do. So we have a template that's available, which the trial management committee then uses to adapt according to what they need for that particular trial.
Okay. And certainly we need to think about how we're going to conduct these monitoring visits. How are we going to train our staff to conduct these monitoring visits, do you think?
Yeah, so I think definitely upskilling your staff is a key component of being able to implement a monitoring strategy at your centre. So whether that might involve sending staff off for external training courses or whether you have that expertise internally within your organisation or your unit is really dependent on your individual circumstances, I think.
Okay, Sally, did you want to add something in there?
Yeah, I think that's where the monitoring program that we implemented definitely comes in, because our program that we implemented was a self-initiated program whereby it was a peer-to-peer internal review program. So previously I was the manager of an oncology network, which included about 8 different clinical trial units. So the internal monitoring program that we implemented involved one trial coordinator from a unit monitoring the work and a project from another clinical trial unit. And so for us, that was a great educational tool for one staff member for one unit to visit another unit, see how things were done, but also see how they conduct the trials. I suppose similar to the other 2 programs that have been discussed, this internal program was also a risk-based approach. A unit could nominate a trial that they wanted to be monitored, or it was around processes and mainly due to patient safety. Processes regarding that to look at consent and those type of processes. And we found that due to the differing levels of experience amongst the clinical trial units, we also needed to develop a standard workbook. And this included the process to be conducted during the on-site monitoring. It included checklists to follow so that the differing levels of staff all could be involved and learn from this process.
A checklist certainly sounds like a really good tool that we could all use. I'm interested to hear, did you focus on the regulatory side of things, or were you more on patient eligibility, safety reporting, informed consent?
We actually did a little bit of both. So there were 2 types of monitoring that we did. One was a process-driven and one was a project-driven. And as I said, the units could nominate which they wanted. They could nominate the trial. We definitely did look at a lot of the critical data points, those aspects of the trials that aren't considered routine, and they were then monitored closely, and patient safety most definitely. So to confirm patient eligibility, we reviewed informed consents, looked at that process, the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and the review of all safety events. And we did find, was this program that we ran for about 4 years, that our major finding was always around the informed consent process, how it was documented, how it was done, and the whole concept that it is a process, not just a signing of a form.
And did you find interesting when you had, other units auditing or monitoring another unit, did you find that was a real eye-opener for the staff that were doing it? Did they find it was educational for them? Do you think they learned from the experience?
Most definitely, yeah, most definitely. We got a lot of great feedback from the staff, and it was a volunteer-based program. So the clinical trial coordinator would nominate themselves to be the one involved. And what we did find that the smaller units that were involved in this monitoring program really learnt a lot from our larger, more established clinical trial units. So it was definitely a great way of sharing processes and upskilling the whole trial units across our network.
Okay. And what about resourcing for this level of monitoring? How did you resource this model within institutions? So, Kathryn, who was responsible at Central Coast for undertaking the monitoring plan that you've put in place?
It sat with a research governance officer who developed the process and the tools, adapted those from others at other LHDs, actually, sort of did a call out for those types of tools and checklists and then adapted them. But then it was becoming a big job for the one research governance officer. So a second research governance officer was put on initially 2 days per week, but then has since become a full-time role. So that research governance officer isn't only responsible for monitoring. There's other clinical trial projects that RGO takes on, such as implementing the new National Clinical Trials Governance Framework and the new New South Wales Health Clinical Trial Management System, but their primary role is the monitoring of clinical trials. But it is something that I think we just started small, and then we've sort of built it up and learnt from the experience that we've gained in doing the trials. And interesting that Sally mentioned the informed consent process, because that was also an area that we have found to be a challenge for some investigators. And so that research governance officer has since developed an SOP, standard operating procedure, specifically for the informed consent process that we can provide to new investigators or some of the clinical trial units that might want a little bit more information about how to do that well.
That's really important where you said the standard operating procedures, because that was also one of the big findings when we first started the peer-to-peer review for the monitoring, was that some of these smaller units didn't have those standard operating procedures. And so it makes it quite difficult to monitor their processes when they haven't actually got them documented down. So that was a really important thing within our network, to then look and share and develop a great set of standard operating procedures that can be then implemented.
Creating templates and SOPs that can be shared across the different clinical trial units, we've found that to be a real plus from conducting the monitoring visits.
Definitely.
Okay. Kat, how did you go about resourcing your model within your institution at GenesisCare?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. So we use a little bit of a mixed model to resource our monitoring. So for some studies, we might use in-house staff to conduct monitoring. So, for example, the project manager for that trial or some other internal staff. Sometimes we provide that opportunity to our clinical research coordinators who are suitably qualified. Alternatively, for larger or more complex or higher risk studies, we might actually outsource the monitoring to another provider, such as like a contract research organisation or other provider who offers those monitoring services. So it really does, again, depend on the type of study and the sort of risk assessment that's being conducted at the very beginning. And I guess the other aspect is around how we then finance the monitoring services for a study. So it's really critical for us when we build our budget at the study sort of development stage at the very beginning that we account for what kind of monitoring might be required within our study budgets, taking into account the fact that a lot of investigator-initiated research might be funded by grants or by businesses. It's really important to think about from the very beginning.
Great. So we've heard from all of you here and 3 really different models. What are some of the challenges you faced when setting this up? Did you get a lot of resistance from people? Was it more around resourcing? Did anyone want to talk to that?
Yeah, I'll talk about the peer-to-peer review model that we generated. It obviously relied on central coordination. So that was probably a challenge in that it needed somebody to be the driving force, to write the manuals, to continually review the program, amend it, identify areas for improvement. Then obviously the monitoring schedule. The other ladies have both spoken about finding the time and making sure it's suitable for all parties involved.
Thanks, Sally, for those insights from Newcastle Private Hospital. Kathryn, what about at Central Coast? Did you have any challenges setting it all up? Was it just resourcing that stuff? You mentioned that you had started with 1 and now you're up to 2 staff.
Yeah, so it's probably about a half-time role that we have dedicated to the monitoring, and you do find some resistance sometimes, but we just try to provide reassurance that it's a requirement and that we're there to support them. And I suppose one of the biggest challenges is finding the time to suit some investigators who are also very busy clinicians, but just being flexible and trying to give them a broad range of dates and times to try and fit it in with them tends to help.
Yeah, it does sound like a lot of work, but obviously I think there's a lot of benefits to this as well. We're all aware that we have to adhere to GCP, and now with the new national governance framework coming in and abiding by the national statement, it sounds like you've all also seen some benefits to this. We talked a little bit about education. Would you like to comment on the benefits you saw at Central Coast, Kathryn?
Sure, yeah. So I suppose, as you mentioned, for accreditation purposes, it has helped us to identify gaps and barriers within the processes of the clinical trial unit, so that with the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework coming on board for accreditation, I think it's really helped us to try and fill some of those gaps. And one of the biggest benefits has just been the building of the relationships between our research office and the separate clinical trial units. And by doing those visits and going to them and then providing the follow-up and the support afterwards, I think they feel more familiar with us and are more willing to contact us if they have any issues. Even when there have been some issues that have been brought up and we've had to do an investigation, could be a possible breach, then I think the way we've conducted that and then provided them support has given them that reassurance that we are there to support them.
Okay. Sally, did you want to chat about the benefits you saw at your institution?
Yeah, most definitely. And I totally agree. It was not the easiest thing to achieve, and implementing a monitoring program is hard, but it definitely had its benefits where we were with the peer-to-peer review program. It facilitated communication and relationships between the clinical trial units who might previously had been acting alone. They've now brought them together to be a bit more of a network. It increased the knowledge sharing between the clinical trial units and provided that educational forum, that two-way education process. It did, as Katherine was saying, identify gaps within some of the units. And as I've previously mentioned, we did then implement some great standard operating procedures, which helped those smaller units that hadn't established themselves fully. So definitely had some great benefits and helped the units along the way.
Yeah. Katherine?
So I think mentioning the networking between the clinical trials, we've also now facilitating a clinical trials network group where we have representation from all the different clinical trial units, and we were able to survey them. They provided us information about issues they're having, and they're now developing an operational plan for clinical trials across the district. So I think doing the monitoring has assisted with bringing together that in the hope that we can build the clinical trials portfolios within those units.
Kat, did you want to chat about the benefits you saw from the monitoring system you put in place?
Yeah, so I think I come from a little bit of a different perspective, and I'm very lucky in that monitoring has been kind of business as usual at GenesisCare from before I even joined the team. So what we've really focused on since I've been here is more around refining that program to follow more of a risk-based approach. And I think the main benefit that we've seen from that transition is that it allows us to more efficiently utilise our resources across monitoring. So, for example, being able to focus on higher risk studies and monitoring in more detail, rather than utilising, I guess, a one-size-fits-all monitoring approach where you might be over-monitoring some studies and under-monitoring others. So I think that really allows us to more efficiently utilise the limited resources that we have to conduct monitoring, and it gives us a sustainable kind of program in the longer term.
I can tell from all those models, the different models you've presented today, that those of us working in this space are going to have to work this out at our own institutions and see what works best and develop a model within our own institutions, but maybe using a little bit of each and, being mindful, though, of the volume of trials we're trying to manage, as Kat said, making sure we monitor and that we manage within the resources that we've got available.
And I think it's important to remember too that the documentation of a monitoring is only part of the process. So most of us have talked about how we had these great checklists, but also monitoring can be done face-to-face. You all can learn a lot about a unit's processes and the way they do things by talking to the staff about how they run things. So important to remember that documentation is important, but it's only part of the process.
Great. So before we wrap up today, were there any final points you wanted to let everyone know?
I think probably, Sharon, for institutions that don't have a monitoring process, it's just a matter of putting something in place and making a start. And if you look at it from a risk-based process, maybe just look at those clinical trials that you think are of the highest risk and focus on those to begin with, and start off small, and then you can build on the experience as you go along to improve or broaden the program as required.
That's a really good point. And I think it's important, if you do that, just to start with those critical data points and those surrounding patient safety, those ones that are the key there to make sure that things are being done the way they need to be being done.
Yeah, completely agree with that. I think where you start might not be where you end up, and that's okay. I think putting something in place, seeing how it goes, and then refining it as you go is, all you can do to get it going.
And with accreditation of clinical trials, we know it's going to be on a maturity scale. So at least if you can show you've got a process in place that you're developing, I think that will go a long way.
Well, this has given everyone plenty to think about as we all work towards establishing systems within our own institutions. Thanks for your time today, Katherine, Kat and Sally. I really appreciate hearing about the work you've already undertaken in this important area. We're all still learning, and it's great to hear about what you've set up within your own institutions. Also, for the people listening, Sydney Health Partners, the New South Wales Regional Health Partners and Sphere have information on their websites that can be referenced, and we invite you to spend some time looking at these. I'm Sharon Lee. Thanks for listening to episode 2, Clinical Trials in Focus.